It seems like all of these different world food price indices are making new highs every month for over 12 months now. So as you can see with the charts there on your screen, the CRB Foodstuff Index is now at an all-time high, higher than even the Arab Spring. Also, the other food price index, the FAO Food Price Index, is also right around a record all-time high as well. And this is not even counting what you're seeing in the grocery store and all the news stories coming out. The Super Bowl was last weekend, and what we saw last weekend, prior to that, there were articles in the New York Post about how chicken wing prices were up 26% in 12 months. Just insane price increases for food and energy with all these rules, regulations, red tape. But what is the most funny is that when I was doing these food price videos in early to mid 2020, I was getting all these nasty comments below the videos from deflationistas saying how in a couple months, these supply chain issues, these food shortages, the food price increases, and again, this was back in early to mid 2020, so this was over 18 months ago. This was almost 2 years ago, from these deflationistas talking about how I was overblowing things, it was hyperbole, I was exaggerating things, that food prices would be back down soon, and here we are, the new normal, and we're just starting to see more wage hikes. We're starting to see more workers in many different countries and many different states here in the United States demand higher wages. So we're just starting to see in certain parts of the supply chain higher wages. And then on top of that, unless you have oil prices crash, you have higher energy costs. So these energy input costs, growing energy costs that you have for planting crops that feed the proteins, that feed the meat, all these costs are rising. And speaking of meat and big meat, President Joe Biden, he has a very unhealthy obsession with big meat. He talks about big meat way too much. A very unhealthy obsession with big meat, probably to change the narrative. I can't stop laughing. I'm going to probably have to edit some of this stuff out, how ridiculous his talking points are from his marketing department. I don't know why they let him talk about big meat so much. It's freaking hilarious, though. Anyways, as proxies to higher agriculture prices, we have stocks like John Deere, which makes the tractors and other farming equipment. John Deere stock has just been on fire. The high-frequency trading algorithm, the trend traders, these professional traders that like very liquid stocks, they are using John Deere stock as a proxy for higher food and higher agriculture prices. But there's problems with some of these agriculture ETFs, and I was writing about this in articles for patrons, I think back in early 2020. The most popular agriculture ETF, which is DBA, you should really take a look at the holdings of that ETF, of that agriculture ETF. Now, for years, the largest holdings in DBA were 15, 20, 25% US Treasuries. And it was not just overnight. They were holding large portions of US Treasuries. And I just checked DBA again in the last couple days, and they had even more exotic, even more weird holdings in there with some type of inverse US Treasury product around interest rates and treasuries in an agriculture ETF. And it was not a tiny amount, and it was not held overnight. It was about 15-20% of the total holdings. So they have futures contracts or exposure to futures contracts for some agriculture, some soft commodities, futures contracts in there. But then they also have this really weird exotic, and it's a large position in either US Treasuries in the past for years that an agriculture ETF, in my opinion, should not have, or this exotic leveraged inverse other ETF there on interest rates and treasuries. That should not be in an agriculture ETF. The DBA is an extremely liquid ETF, so that's why it's used. But the stuff inside the ETF, a lot of it is toxic sausage. I know that's not going to be popular with the trend traders, the professional day traders, the high frequency traders, hedge fund guys that listen to this and just trade whatever's the most liquid. They probably also trade GLD and other garbage too. But there are big red flags inside a DBA, but I guess if you're a day trader and it's a liquid exposure to your higher ag plays, I guess you don't care. And fertilizer stocks are, of course, high. Fertilizer, because of energy inputs for natural gas liquids, natural gas, other parts of the fertilizer. I think Russia announced that they will not be exporting a key component for fertilizer, one of the key components, for at least the next 12 to 18 months. So you have all these input costs for food rising. So I do not see lower food costs, lower food prices anytime soon. Now, I have friends who are restaurant owners, who are patrons, and also listen to these YouTube videos, and they're telling me that the price of steak and other seafood and meat prices have risen so rapidly lately that instead of doing shrinkflation, instead of raising the menu prices so often, they've just pulled items from their menu. So that will probably continue. There will be more stagflation in menu prices in the restaurant industry, and there will be, of course, and unfortunately, even more shrinkflation at the grocery store and then at restaurants. Finally, if you like content like this and want to help keep content like this free so it doesn't all end up behind a paywall, or you want far more in-depth content, research, financial education, and analysis than I provide in these short little free videos, there are now over 200 articles and audio podcasts behind my paywall exclusive for patrons, all for only $5 a month. I think it is one of the best deals out there. In just in the last 10 or so weeks, there are now over a dozen articles and audio podcasts. There's a natural gas LNG article. Probably in the next week or so, there will be an article out or an audio podcast out about a potential gold mining takeover target that has had large amounts of insider buying in the last month, as well as an update for Sandstorm Gold with the hot modded restructuring, turning it into a gold stream. That'll be exclusive for patrons. And there are also audio podcasts on the uranium market, precious metal royalty and streaming companies, which are going to do very, very well in this environment of rising energy prices and rising wages. Other costs are also rising. I don't really see any signs of deflation. So these deflationistas are saying that demand is going to collapse. I just see that there's supply problems, a lot of supply problems. I don't see signs that supply problems are really improving. And again, there's a lot behind the paywall on global macro commodities and individual companies in commodity sectors like uranium, oil and natural gas, gold and silver mining for only $5 a month. And just in the last 29 or so weeks, there are now 43 new articles and audio podcasts out. So please check that out. So if I could wrap up the short little video very quickly, there is a lot of evidence of supply side problems. There is a lot of evidence that many input costs are still rising. And the big one here for food is fertilizer costs and also rising energy prices, because a lot of these crops require an enormous amount of energy to plant and harvest and grow and then transport the crops either to restaurants or grocery stores. So there's all these rising costs in food supply chains. There's shrinkflation, there's stagflation. Workers are demanding higher wages. I don't see a lot of evidence of falling consumer demand for a lot of items. And these politicians and bureaucrats, they continue to make things worse with all these mask mandates, although now they're finally starting to pull them. Rules, regulations, red tape, you have workers' wages going up. It would be an absolute nightmare right now to be a restaurant owner and have to deal with the headache. It was very difficult for a restaurant before the pandemic. During the last almost 2 years of this pandemic, it must be a nightmare for them. I could not fathom trying to run a restaurant in all the changing rules, regulations, red tape, supply chain problems, rising costs. And then you have politicians, bureaucrats, and regulators, especially Joe Biden and his unhealthy obsession with big meat, just making things worse. So the more they try to help, and I'm using air quotes here, the worse things are going to get. And again, I'm looking for evidence of consumer demand collapsing. I'm looking for evidence of falling prices. We're not seeing it. Just like the Fed is saying how they're going to reduce their balance sheet, and the Fed's balance sheet in just the last 2 weeks or so is up another $40 billion. So the Fed's claiming that there's going to be another quote unquote significant balance sheet reduction, and yet the Fed's balance sheet made another new all-time high, up another $40 billion in 2 weeks. The Fed's words do not match the Fed's actions.